To kick off for today's event, we want to, first of all, thank you from wherever you're joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Olabisi Delibayo Akinkube. I'm an assistant professor at the Schulich School of Law and an incoming executive council member of the American Society of International Law, and a co-convener of the 2022 ISIL Global Series African Region event with James Gathie. We want to thank all the sister societies that have collaborated for this second series: the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network, the African Association of International Law, the African Society of International Law, the Pan-African Lawyers Union, and the African International Economic Law Network, as well as the Institute for African Women in Law. It is our honor at afronomicslaw.org to deepen African-related international law issues with ASIL. And so thank you to Professor Gregory Schaffer for the invitation to be part of today's event. The plan today is briefly as follows. I will pose a question each to our esteemed panelists. They will each have a maximum of 5 minutes to respond to each question in the first round. My cue to the panelists is that once their time is up, I'll unmute my mic. After the first round, all the panelists will have a general question posed to them, and they will all have about 3 minutes to respond to that. For our attendees today, please feel free to use the Q&A box to pose your questions, and we'll get to them surely if there's time after the second round of questions. And so to introduce our panelists today, Professor Japa Dawuni has joined us. She is an associate professor of political science from Howard University. We have Donald Daya, who is the CEO of Pan-African Lawyers Union, Arusha, Tanzania. We have Dr. Magali Masamba, a senior fellow of the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. And we also have Dr. Chidebe Nwako Matthew, who is a senior lecturer from the Faculty of Law, University of Nigeria. We're waiting on Professor Fallou Sam, a special advisor on economic affairs to the President of Senegal, to join us. So without much ado, I want to thank our panelists again for agreeing to be part of this conversation. It is a very important one on the issue of post-pandemic recovery, sovereign debt, and what it means once we think about climate justice as well. So without wasting much time, my first question will go to Dr. Masamba. Dr. Masamba, given your expertise on sovereign debt issues, have you found the responses to the sovereign debt challenges African countries face, especially in light of the impact of COVID-19, adequate? With the spring meetings of the Bretton Woods institutions coming up next month, what actions will you recommend that the government take? Dr. Masamba, you have your 5 minutes now.
Thank you very much for that question. And it's a question that I've been exploring quite extensively. And I will share a link to a recent book that has been co-edited by myself and Professor Daniel Bradlow on COVID-19 and sovereign debt, the case of SADC. So we discuss some of these issues in more detail. I'll share that link. But to answer your question, I'll start off by talking about what has been the response before I talk about its adequacy. So in response to mounting debt difficulties and challenges with repayment, the G20 launched a number of initiatives during the COVID-19 pandemic. One is the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which was launched to provide countries with temporary repayment standstills for their bilateral debt. So the DSSI is basically a tailored approach to reduce, suspend, and delay the repayments of 73 qualifying nations for their bilateral debt. Interestingly, China was not a major participant in the DSSI, and another component or another stakeholder that wasn't a big participant and which should have been is the private sector. So once you look at Africa's debt profile, you would see that our debt profile is now leaning towards the greater use of private sector debt, and specifically through the use of Eurobonds. So during the DSSI, many African countries were concerned because they said, okay, yes, this does provide some assistance, but it's only a temporary standstill. what do we do about the private sector debt that is a big or a large percentage of our debt? Another question that we had was, what do we do about our Chinese debt, which China is our largest bilateral creditor. Now, and the G20 expired in December 2021, and as a continuation, we had the common framework. So despite what the name seems to suggest, the common framework is technically speaking a case-by-case approach or case-by-case debt treatment to support long-term debt sustainability, including private sector debt. So here we have the common framework, and many countries thought, okay, this could be a better option. It's for the countries that qualified for the DSSI. It now includes players like China, which are important from the African perspective, but it also includes privately held debt. However, a second issue emerged during this time, and that was the fact that credit rating agencies actually threatened to downgrade, and not even threatened, in the case of Ethiopia, that was the case. They threatened credit downgrades if countries participated in the common framework. Now, at present, the common framework, and I don't know if this would be a controversial statement, but at present, the common framework has not been successful. And there have been statements by the IMF and the World Bank that we are not where we need to be. So that raises the question, where do we need to be and how do we get there? So in the past, I've spoken a lot about an international framework for debt restructuring, and I focus on debt restructuring because the idea of debt relief, which is a major suggestion by many African countries, I don't think that's suitable. I don't think that we should rely on the forgiveness and the kindness of strangers as a solution or a long-term solution. So restructuring is needed. And at the end of the day, I think I will continue to argue for an international framework that allows for effective, fair, transparent restructuring. But at the same time, there are many innovative proposals that are even coming from African scholars, African institutions, as well as institutions that focus on Africa, like the UN Economic Commission for Africa. We at the University of Pretoria are doing extensive research on a creditor-led approach to restructuring by having a fund that deals with the debts of developing countries. And I'll be happy to provide more information on that. I'm not so sure how I'm doing with time. So I'll be happy to provide more information with that and to share the details of my team. But there are innovative approaches, but these approaches are short-term. And at the end of the day, we keep going back to that question, do we need an international framework for debt restructuring? So it's like every decade, we get back to that fundamental question. My answer is yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Masamba. You did very well with time. So you saved us just about a minute there. And I think it's a very good one to kick off because this means we can have very good conversation around those excellent reflections, and we'll circle back to you shortly. So my second question is for Donald Dyer. So for you, public interest litigation is one of the things that the Pan-African Lawyers Union has done extremely well, and thank you very much for spearheading that important work on the continent. In doing so, and on your work on financial transparency and sovereign debt issues, how do you see international law's role being relevant in this particular context? Over to you, Donald. You have another 5 minutes now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you brought up the importance of, or the issue of litigation in this field of sovereign debt, of illicit financial flows, on financial transparency generally. And I think that's important. Let me make a quick comment about that before I talk about international law generally. And to say that, yes, in this field, especially the field of sovereign debt, is a field where those that represent us in government, whether elected officials or high-level bureaucrats, negotiate and entered into deals on our behalf many times without any involvement of us or even proper information to us. And you can just look across the continent, countries that have had Eurobonds and how the Eurobonds have been negotiated and the kind of public angst it has raised. And citizens are left many times begging for information, begging for inclusion, begging for consultation, and so on. Except for those citizens that have now decided that, you know what, we're going to disrupt this field. And one of the ways of disrupting the field is by way of disruptive litigation. So of course, we have seen some freedom of information litigation, especially at national courts, and we continue to encourage that. There's some beginning of them in regional courts, and I think that's a good thing, at least the courts, regional courts and tribunals on the continent. I think a real standout has been the litigation around the Mozambique tuna bonds scandal, both in Mozambique and in other jurisdictions like the UK and so on. And I think this is really good because you're seeing citizens calling for accountability. You're seeing people being made to pay for it. For us, we have just recently initiated litigation, although this is more on illicit financial flows and the setting up of an international financial center in Kigali. So we've taken the Rwandan government to the East African Court of Justice, together PALU, that's together the Tax Justice Network Africa, and saying that provisions around the International Financial Center contravene, among others, commitments made around the East African Community Customs Market. So we are beginning to see a bit of that. But what's the role of international law generally? Part of the challenge that we face is that there's insufficient international law that calls, for the rights of the citizens in this field of sovereign debt. In Africa, of course, we've got an AU Assembly Declaration. That's the 2015 AU Assembly Declaration that adopted the report and recommendations of the high-level panel on illicit financial flows from Africa that was chaired by His Excellency, retired President Thabo Mbeki. So it has the level of soft law in Africa. And what I think we will continue to see going forward is more calls for soft law in this area. So we'll, for instance, be seeing calls to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to speak out, maybe by way of a general comment or by way of principles on human rights implications in sovereign debt. And especially now that in the context of the rush to incur a lot of debt to deal with COVID, both from multilateral institutions, bilateral institutions, but even from private lenders, you probably will see calls towards a common African position on sovereign debt to be passed by the African Union Summit, the Assembly of Heads of State or Government. So international law is important. It is insufficient, but we're seeing work by the people towards developing more strong legal principles on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donald, for that again. So with respect to time, so far the panelists are doing excellent work. But also with respect to your interventions, and for those who are joining us, it's important to let this out that this first round is about sovereign debt issues, and that the second round of the questions will drill in more into how this overlaps with climate change. So the next question, which is the third one, is for Professor Dawuni. And for you, you do a lot of important work across various issues, but also personnel issues. And so as different parts of the world, gradually move to post-pandemic recovery, we know that is not the case with every part of the world, but it is ongoing anyway. The implications of sovereign debt distress are felt by nations and citizens alike at a very personal level. So yet the impacts have been highly unequal at the interpersonal level. And so in your view, the question is, how can the gendered impacts of the pandemic be better addressed? Over to you, Professor Dawuni. Thank you.
Thank you very much, BC, and I'd like to thank the American Society for International Law, Afronomics Law, and of course the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network for bringing this panel together. I'm under a lot of pressure because the previous speakers have kept to time, they've been on point, so my pressure level now is high. So I'm going to try and do this as best as I can within the short time that I have. I think our feedback, and thank you, Dr. Masamba, for laying out really what you've been doing, the work in this area, and some of the important questions that need to be looked at. And I think I'll build up also on what Donald said about looking at this as an international law issue. You know, the name alone, sovereign debt, what does that tell us? Sovereignty. And when you're talking about sovereignty within international law, international relations, you're talking about states. So where are the non-state actors? Now, as Donald said, the states, the sovereign entities go and do these negotiations, enter into these agreements, sometimes with little or no input from the society, the people who are actually involved or who are going to face the impact. So how do we make sure that there is a connect between what the state is doing at the international level and the impact of what we may call the trickle-down effect on the very, very basic level, which includes the household level. And that's where we need to disintegrate or disaggregate the sovereign level implications and who it affects. And at the very bottom of every society, maybe more like if we were to invest in the top, but often we know that if we were to trickle it all the way down into society, is the family unit. That is where society gets started up, building up. And who do we often find at the family level, at the household level? Often in the binary context, it will probably be a male and female, and then in between that, there may be children. Now, within the African context, we also know that the family unit is not just the nuclear family, it's the extended family. So who gets the impact of all of these debts that nations are accruing? Is the individuals at the family. Now, I will try to rush through it very quickly in terms of how economic decisions impact women, and this whole discussions about the involvement of women in development, the involvement of women as agents of development. We do know that when international organizations are looking at debt, looking at investments, and where the money should go, they don't often give it to women. It goes into the hands of men. And we also know that economic ventures within African systems are controlled largely by women. Talk about the marketplace women in Lagos or the marketplace women in Makola, Accra, Ghana. So how do we make sure that decisions that are made at a sovereign level will have a positive impact for women at the ground level? I'll say this very quickly, that in addition to the fact that women are also engineers of economic development and economic progress, they are also the ones often responsible, mainly responsible for taking care of children. So that means that healthcare decisions, educational decisions, general social welfare would often fall on women in these processes. Now, men also have the impact of bad sovereign debts, having an impact. Men lose jobs, and then that also means that if men lose jobs, sometimes it comes back to the home, because then the stress, it manifests itself sometimes in the form of gender-based violence, domestic violence, which we've seen increase during the pandemic. So in the 1 minute I have left, what are some of the solutions? How do we address this at the interpersonal level? That when decisions are being made, I'm going to give 6 points, so very quickly, and then we can have discussion. One, that we should look at development issues with a human face, but more so with a woman face. What are the gendered implications of these debts on the home level of women and on children? Two, that when we are coming up with these decisions, we should listen to the needs and priorities of women. Development agents often come in, governments go out to get their money, and they are looking at national development, which is great. But what are the priorities of women, who are the ones holding the household, holding the marketplace, holding the communities? We should listen to them in order to prioritize what governments go out to seek money for. Three, we should have women at the table. Women should be part of the decision-making processes, the negotiations that lead to these debts that we are incurring, in order to make sure that these issues are addressed, not just from the woman perspective, but often we know that women also have ways of thinking that may not necessarily be what traditional men may think about. Four, we should invest in SMEs, small and medium scale businesses, which are often held by women, who are going to be the ones who will drive production, drive income, and therefore, if they are able to expand and grow, that could also help governments to service their debts, but most importantly, that they will not incur the debts. Two very quick ones, my time is up. Three, that we should also recognize and respect women's investments and contributions. The national development is also something that is highly dependent on women, like I've mentioned before. And lastly, we should involve the role of civil society organizations, which is what we're doing today. The Afronomics Law is doing a lot of research on these topics. The African Justice Sovereign Debt Network is doing a lot of activism and advocacy on this issue. PALU is engaging in litigation. And then, of course, at AWO, we are also doing our bit to ensure that these governments are held responsible in different ways. So those are the quick points. I have exceeded my time and I yield whatever left of it back to BC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dawuni. The benefit of this is that with Dr. Masamba and Donald, time is saved for you as well. So excellent interventions, and I've taken notes of those points that you have raised as well. And I think it's important to also say the really excellent work you are leading with the work of the Institute on African Women in Law. So thank you very much to you for those excellent reflections. So we move now to Dr. Matthew Chidebenwako. He's joined us from Abuja, Nigeria. And to you, it's important to situate this question, I guess, in the context of the Nigerian society. And so, drawing on your experience, the Nigerian experience, the question to you is, on the one hand, can you reflect on the challenges and limitations of the sovereign debt for Nigeria? I mean, people talk about Nigeria, how huge the economy it is in the African continent and so on. Do you think that the current international financial architecture is well positioned to respond to the challenges posed with post-pandemic recovery for a country like Nigeria? Thank you very much for joining us today too.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this very opposite conversation. I must say that experiences shared by other African countries are shared with Nigeria. But then Nigeria is in a peculiar situation, not just by virtue of its position in the West African sub-region, but also because of the potential effect of the Nigerian economy. There's the possibility of a spillover to our smaller, for lack of a better word, neighbors. But that said, the international financial architecture one would think that it's more than equipped to solve these problems pertaining to sovereign debt. But then there are injustices in the system which are very much highlighted, which has prompted the calls for, like Dr. Magali mentioned, the common African position, disruptive litigation, and all those problems also apply to, all those particular factors also apply to Nigeria. But in a nutshell, I would say that the international financial architecture is sort of outdated, because of the fact that you would hear recently calls for debt relief dominated narratives on African economies, because it appears the powerful countries or the developed countries increasingly ignore the rules. And then because of that, the developing countries face very stringent measures when it comes to accessing sovereign debt. But if you look at the numbers, debt to GDP to debt ratio is about 35% in Nigeria's case, but you have developed countries that have 200%. Without mentioning names, because it's not really necessary, but that fact remains. You also have the issue of risk assessment by credit rating agencies, which is a particular problem because they claim to be evidence-based, but then they attach unspoken political criteria and then consistently underestimate the size of most African economies. The data upon which these assessments are being done are more or less outdated. And despite economic growth of around 3.6% in 32 African states, the ratings still are not favorable. And that is the same for Nigeria. But then there are internal factors. I mean, it's not enough for us to point fingers at the international level. There are internal factors that are responsible for Nigeria's poor showing. As it is, prior to the pandemic, Nigeria was already on sort of a free fall because of the constant borrowing. And the numbers do not help because Nigeria's revenue has dwindled. First, the government has had to provide stimulus packages in the aftermath of the pandemic. But then you have problems with subsidy, crude thefts, global factors that mean that Nigeria is not able to generate enough revenue. So as it stands, GDP to revenue ratio is 7%, which shows that Nigeria is teetering on the brink. So there are issues of transparency that still remain and which must be addressed domestically. For instance, the price of crude is pushing $120, but Nigeria is yet to meet its OPEC plus obligations. The Russia-Ukraine war, you would think, will be beneficial. Nobody likes that there's a war, but then with the increase in the price of crude, yet Nigeria is unable to, generate revenue for development. There's the danger of a food crisis because Nigeria imports most of our wheat and fertilizer components from Russia. So as it is, there are genuine problems in the system internally, which must be addressed. We've said as part of the solutions, we've recommended that Nigeria defines, identify and report all government debts and improve transparency of the debt profile. For instance, external debt stock by the Debt Management Office was put at 35.5 trillion naira, while the IMF is suggesting that it's pushing 65.2 trillion naira in reality. There's also the need for Nigeria to develop a national integrated revenue spending and debt management strategy, because this well and means policy where the CBN tends to constantly bail out the federal government when there's a budgetary crisis. I mean, there's no other evidence of the fact that Nigeria is going broke in the long term. And then there's a need to address concerns regarding the social contract. Critically, the Nigerian public does not trust the government. I would believe that there's been some insight from other African countries. We're saying these policymakers, technocrats, politicians go to negotiate these debts without input from the citizenry, or even if the private sector. I mean, not up to 2 years ago, there was some sort of a scandal, at the National Assembly, where due to legislative oversight, it was discovered that the terms for a particular loan which Nigeria had sought from China was written in Mandarin. So these things show you really where the problem lies. And there's a need to obtain full participation of all creditors, including private ones, in debt restructuring. Some scholars have suggested the elimination of reliance on interest-paying bonds, which may be sort of drastically a problem for revenue. So the solution, they've argued, is creating special purpose vehicles for packaging infrastructure and assets for interest-free financing. So these are some of the steps that Nigeria could take internally. The fact remains that there's some injustice in the international financial architecture. However, we must not pay as right to our own internal problems. And at the end of the day, this is often seen as a topic which is left the exclusive preserve of policymakers or for legislative oversight. There's very little legal participation, and that's why I thought this is a perfect opportunity to at least learn from other speakers and also, interact. I've learned from Dr. Donald what is going on in Tanzania, and I think that's worthy of copying, for lack of a better word. So I'll just yield my time to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Nwankwo. You've said a lot in those 5 minutes, like every speaker has done on this first round. There's so much here, and I think something which is essential and maybe bears repeating. You said towards the end is how these issues tends to be, presented as obscure. They are not things you should be concerned about because you don't see the direct connection to how you live every day. But as Professor Dawouni said, these things have trickle down effects. It's right. The implication is about how much individuals can live and enjoy in a society at the end of the day. And so, whether as lawyers, as economists, and other policy experts that have roles to play in these issues, I love the way you've really put them together. So to just sort of tie it together, issues of justice is now centering, which maybe sort of leads us very well to the climate change dimension, but also the national, the international aspects of this, and the role of actors that do not sit very well into those national and international, creditors, credit rating agencies are critical in this process. So thank you so much for this first round. It looks like we lost Donald, but that's no problem. We have three great. Oh, he's back. Look at that. So this is excellent. Okay, so let's go to the second round. And with this round, it's 3 minutes. I love the time we've done. So please, let's just keep it going. This is general. I'll pose the questions to all of you, and maybe we can go the same way we started, right, with Dr. Masamba. This is on the climate change and responses here. How can, coming back to the issue of international law, how can it be mobilized to respond adequately to the disproportionate burden of climate change? That's one dimension of the question. Another dimension of the question you can choose to reflect on is to maybe speak to responses at the international, regional, sub-regional, and national policy and legislative spaces, as well as the courts. Because as we all know, issues of climate change are intricately complex issues. It's not an exclusive issue for some organization in Geneva or a court in Tanzania alone to respond to. And so we welcome your thoughts on these issues. 3 to 4 minutes on this issue. Dr. Masamba.
And thank you so much for giving me the floor again. It was very interesting to hear the contributions, the different perspectives from the other panelists. The issue of climate change, environmental justice, and so forth is so important for African countries, partly because African countries are especially vulnerable to climate-related issues. So here, 2 things come to mind. The first one relates to how can climate issues be reflected in borrowing instruments. But another thing is also how can climate-related issues also impact how we restructure our debt. One thing that comes to my mind is, and I'm kind of linking my response more to to the first question you asked me, what are some of the solutions? An important solution that has been brought up when it comes to how do we restructure our debt, or how do we have a response when there's a catastrophe, including those that relate to climate change, is the use of what we call state contingent instruments. So these are relevant because they link debt repayment to a debtor's capacity to pay, which could be influenced, for example, by climate-related issues like a cyclone that has an economic effect. So I think that when we're talking about the climate issue, in my view, there's been a lot of focus on, for instance, debt instruments that are related to climate, like debt for nature instruments that could be used in restructuring. But I also think that African countries, especially as we rethink debt instruments, our debt profile, and some of the legal provision in instruments, we do need to start thinking about what happens when things go wrong, specifically when climate-related issues, because we're especially vulnerable, impact our debt repayment. I don't think many African countries, and this is my personal perspective, I don't have statistics for this, I don't think many African countries have provided contingencies for climate-related disasters in their debt instruments. So I would imagine that in the near future, as Africa's debt profile is demonstrating or is showing major concerns, a number of countries are already in distress, other countries are in danger of being in distress. And as the climate-related issues are becoming a reality, I think a big issue that we're going to have, and it's similar to the COVID-19 pandemic, what happens when a pandemic or an international health crisis impacts debt repayment? We haven't really given ourselves that breathing space or that room to potentially reschedule, renegotiate our debt when these emergencies occur. But at the same time, we're in a part of the world that is especially vulnerable. We are not necessarily the highest emitters, but we are probably the ones that, at least developing countries, would be impacted more from the effects of climate change. So it wouldn't only be, for instance, a cyclone, it could even be effects that could cause food shortages, for example. So at this stage, I think, or at least the one contribution I'll put on the table on this relates to the contractual terms and making use of innovative legal provisions in contracts like state contingent instruments that help us reschedule, restructure our debt when things go wrong. So that's the main approach I'll put on the table. I have a bunch of other ideas, but I'll put one in the interest of time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. What I'll say is that there's already a question for you that overlaps with Professor Dauni and Dr. Chidibe Nwakwa to continue to reflect on, which we'll get to after this. It has a dimension for Don as well from Professor Gethi, so we'll get to that shortly. But thank you very much. Donald, over to you now on this question of international law and responses to addressing climate change, and certainly climate finance and all that, that's had to do with it. It has been reflected in a little bit in Dr. Masamba's response, particularly with respect to the limitation that comes with that. But over to you, Donald.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I apologize. I'm in a hotel somewhere in transit and my internet was a bit shaky, so may have missed part of what has been said in the last few minutes when I was switching between service providers. But I'd like to continue the trend set by Dr. Masamba in just giving one major idea now, and then we open up and see how else we can develop the debate. And my pitch is going to be about, just like Dr. Masamba's was, about thinking broadly about international law and thinking innovatively about it. On the issue of climate change, I was just reflecting briefly, on my own readouts that came out on COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference for 2021, which was held last November in Glasgow, Scotland. And of course, some of the inspirational speeches that we saw being made or pitches being made, yet it still brought out the power asymmetries that we have in our international system, where those that contribute the most to the negative aspects of climate change that we're seeing are the ones that are giving the least comparatively, and those that contribute the least in terms of emissions and greenhouse gases and so on, like Africa, will be the ones that will be affected the most. Yet in the negotiations platforms that we have currently, you find that we have the least power to demand, and the powerful states are the ones who will determine in the end what they will give, when they will give it, regardless of whether it is sufficient. So I think this requires us as activists and even architects in the international system to think more broadly about international law. And one place that I'd like us to go into is human rights law, and especially the possibilities within the UN human rights system. Because we see in the human rights system, we can develop principles in a much more participatory manner, a much more equal manner, which can then contribute to our understanding of international law. So I'd like us really to look at the human rights system of the UN, for instance, the UN Human Rights Committee and its ability to issue general comments, like for instance, the 2018 General Comment number 36, which focus on the right to life and Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and its positive provisions around climate change. Look at CEDAW, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and its own general comment number 37, again of 2018, on gender-related dimensions of disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change, the Child Rights Committee as well. And to just say that there's scope for us to push the committee system of the UN better, and to call for more innovative use of special rapporteurs in this area of climate change and human rights. I'll also then just repeat also that there's also scope for innovation in how we push to have collective voice from the developing countries, from the global south. And the point that we made already around common African positions, which then in a sense form some sort of soft law in Africa. And it's interesting that just earlier this month, African countries actually adopted a common African position to integrate gender equality in the climate action agenda. I think this was on the sidelines of the CSW, the Committee on the Status of Women. And I would like to see how this can be used more to strengthen international understanding of the role that international law can play in having more predictable standards and also more fair standards as we debate the climate change agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donald. I love these conversations because everyone sort of starts, and as they're winding down on their time, it's like I'm passing the baton to you now, right? And so I think that goes very well, offers a nice segue for again, Professor Dawuni's excellent interventions on the second round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, BC. No, you're right. I'm just like, okay, keep going, Donald, keep going, because it's so great listening to you. And you've done my work. You know, you brought in discussions about how women and gender issues can be integrated. So I really just want you to keep going. But I'll go back a bit to my kind of international relations perspective again, that we know that international law is based on a system of self-help. You know, from a realist school of thought. And then now, of course, we also have the liberal school of thought, where liberalism shows us that global cooperation helps, and it's a win-win situation. And like we've mentioned, you know, Dr. Masamba mentioned, and we don't need to belabor the point. We don't need data and statistics to show that this is an academic enterprise. This is a reality enterprise that we have seen how the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that the world really is about self-help and self-interest. We have seen how African nations, developing countries, poorer countries were left to themselves largely to survive. Now, I'm not saying that other nations did not help or support or provide vaccines, but we saw the implications on African nations with the low percentages of vaccinations that have happened across the continent. So what can we learn from the COVID-19 situation of self-help and build that into the environmental crisis that has been ongoing for a very long time? You both have said it very well that African nations or developing countries are the least perpetrators, were the ones who suffer it the most. And that is not going to change, unfortunately. So what do we do about international law? The advocacy in this space, academic spaces should continue. Advocacy in terms of civil society organizations should continue, but also knowledge production that really centers the historic dominance of certain powerful nation states in the international system and the implications of those. And I'll draw very quickly on the body of scholarship, the theoretical framing, and we call it scholar activism by scholars who are in the body, you know, the third world approaches to international law, and the ways in which they've been attempting and are doing a good job of showing the relative positionality of African nations or third world, and I use that word in quotes, third world nations within the African system. So how can we do to survive? I think building up on the arguments that have been made by third world approach scholars, one of whom would say is Professor Gathi, who is part of this forum here, is to really ground the implications of international law for African continents. And governments should draw on the scholarship that is coming out of TWIL and other forms of advocacy to understand the ways in which the global system operates. Not to say they don't, but we know that concepts and theories are very important for application to practical reality. And so I'll say for me that we don't have to look at international law in as much as the UN Charter tells us it's a matter of sovereign nations of states. We know that equality of states, we know that, but reality has shown otherwise. And we should draw on African systems of international law, whatever that means for us, in order to come together as a coalition We need to build a stronger African network involving not nations alone, but also scholars, activists to really ground. And because once we come together and we have that force, we hopefully will be able to put onto the bargaining table things that would help us as nations and as individuals within those nations. So I will end here for now.
Again, excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Dawuni, for reminding us that this is a reality enterprise. So this is not something that is up there for academics to just think about in the abstract, but also your invocation, right, for the governments across Africa, you know, to integrate twirl-like thinking into their policy making is critical. And I think the other segue you provided for the role of, you know, activists and civil society organizations, right? And this whole cross-pollination of ideas and not thinking in silo ways is very critical, you know, so thank you very much for that. And I think that provides another way for Dr. Nwankwo to again come in for his own 4 minutes on this segment.
Well, I think basically I would, my own perspective here would be like a concoction of really every other perspective. Yeah, I do think international law is very important vis-a-vis climate change regarding this subject matter. But I think that there's the need for extant regional frameworks to be explored. You know, the idea of building back better, which seems to be the zeitgeist at the African Union level at the moment. And there's no reason why we shouldn't have a harmonized policy, you know, or standardization through the African Union International Law Commission. Because if you look at it domestically, how many, in critical areas like energy, for instance, how many African countries have renewable energy legislations? So if we're talking about it from an international law perspective, whether we choose to use a top-down approach from the AU level, greening the African Continental Free Trade Area regime, there's the need for such actions to take place, whether by policy or through normatively, you know, at the regional level, and that will guide the domestic municipal frameworks. Because, for instance, in the case of Nigeria, there's no Renewable Energy Act. Ghana does have one. Nigeria only recently set up MBET, an institution, the Nigeria Bulk Electricity Trading Corporation, for the purposes of auctioning renewable energy sources. And all these are steps being taken domestically, but which I feel that at the regional level, there might be some sort of blueprints which will be followed by the domestic frameworks. At the end of the day, whether we take these steps or not, is also important from the global financial institutions' perspective to give African decision makers the fiscal and policy space to find their own solutions, because only then will it be autochthonous and truly serve its purpose. So I do think international law, in fact, in this instance, is the guiding light, if you like, in terms of how we move forward when renegotiating, restructuring these agreements and the climate change ramifications.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nwankwo. I think you're right in how you've alluded to the gap in legal and regulatory space once we're thinking about renewable energy across African states. And you know, I mean, not to jump in, it may make one ask, you know, again, so what's the effect of the laws? You know, so what have we done with all the ones we have in relation to climate change? But again, you don't have to respond. It's just how that really invokes thought on this end. I think what is great in about 11 minutes that we have left, which we shouldn't dedicate to discussing again, is to have the panelists again reflect on the question by Professor Gathi. And in this one, you know, again, I'm happy to go to Dr. Masamba, but if Donald Dare wants to go first, I'm fine with that on this particular one, just to mix it up a little bit. So there's a specific question there for Donald, and then there's a question that cuts across the three other panelists' intervention. Is that a fine order to go? Maybe we'll just spend about 1 minute, 1.5 on this one, and then we can, to allow us close effectively as well. Over to you, Don. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the Q&A. What was the specific question for me?
I can read that to you. Don, what can civil society groups, academics, and others do to help with crafting a common African position on sovereign debt? Now, if you need a minute, I can move on. If, assuming Dr. Masamba has seen her own question, I can circle back to you. That may be a better way on this one.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Dr. Masamba.
Okay, so there are two parts of the question. There's the first part that's asking me about the long-term solutions and discussing one, and the second part that's asking me about chiming into the points that have been made about not overlooking the domestic sources of the problem. I'll answer this backwards. On the second point, definitely misborrowing and misuse of debt is one of the major issues with African countries' sovereign debt landscape. Definitely accountability and transparency are important. Two things come to mind that have been partly alluded to. So the first one, I think, is that there should be a role at the time of borrowing and at the time of the allocation and use of debt for different stakeholders like NGOs and civil society organizations. And that's a point that's already been discussed. But secondly, also, we have to look at our fiscal management frameworks and laws, especially when it comes to borrowing. We should encourage parliamentary oversight. Now, on the first part of the question about long-term solutions, I think I'll begin by mentioning the fact that it is clear that there is a need for innovative approaches or innovative solutions. However, when making these solutions, we do have to acknowledge the fact that the reality is that the public, the official sector cannot adequately meet the financial needs of African countries, whether it's to meet the SDG goals or whether it's to actually meet our infrastructure challenges. So there is a big role of the private sector. So in finding solutions, that has been one of the factors that has guided our approach, the fact that the private sector is now a very important stakeholder. So in the 30 seconds, a proposal that we have been working on that has been that is being developed by Professor Daniel Bradlow at the University of Pretoria is called the Debts of Vulnerable Economies Fund, the DOVE Fund. This basically aims at developing a tool that could potentially deter vulture funds. So the fund would basically acquire African debts from the market at market rate or at potentially at a discounted rate, and then provide a case-by-case debt payment standstill. So in our view, and I'm happy to share links to op-eds that have discussed this with its ongoing research. If we're dealing with private sector creditors, what about developing our own private sector creditor that could teach the markets how to behave and the considerations to take into account when restructuring African debt, such as even gender issues or even human rights issues broadly? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Masamba. So we can go to Dr. Dawuni, Dr. Nwako, and then Donald will have the last word on his own question. Does that sound good, Dr. Dawuni, to come to you now?
Just to make sure, are we talking about the question in the chat, in the Q&A box, or the last question that we're supposed to address? Well, okay, you're muted. So
the one in the Q&A box.
Okay,
sorry.
the Q&A box. No, I think I don't really have anything to add. I think for me, it's more of, Magali has really done an excellent job of covering it, and so I don't want to belabor. I would like to save the time for the last question we have to talk about, and maybe I'll build it in.
I'll then give you the floor on that one. Actually, I can allow you going for that now.
Okay, so maybe you can pose a question for the sake of the audience, because
Which is this? Thank you so much. That in the view of our panelists, right, what should the priority of African leaders be in addressing the post-economic pandemic recovery for African states? So this is just like 1 minute each realm now.
Okay. So, all right, thank you. So in the 1 minute I have, and we often talk about women and gender issues, and people always think of it as an add-on. It is not an add-on. Women, like I've said, are the ones who hold our societies together, especially within the African context. It's a historical thing that women have always and continue to hold our societies together. So from the marketplace to the boardroom, let's involve women in decision-making. And I also know there's a lot of move within the AU, within the global circles, to involve the youth. That has become another sexy word, and we shouldn't just use it for the sake of another word that we're using as window dressing. Who are the youth? Where do we find them? And how do we involve them in decision making? Because these are the ones who are going to keep us going forward and to come up with innovative strategies. So let's invest in really getting our youth to understand these issues so that they don't go through some of what some of us did to get to a certain level before we learn some of these things. Let's get them learning from now to understand they have the capacity, they have the capability. Listen to them when they come. And within the African context, my time is up. Within the African context, I know we have a system of age grades and we respect elders, and I'll say we should continue to hold on to that. But let's also listen to the youth, because sometimes the youth can see what the fire that is coming on the ground that the elders on the top may not be able to see. And so let's combine the youth, let's combine women power, and let governments listen and address these issues holistically. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So mainstream gender, mainstream youth, they are not add-ons, right? Thank you so much. So Dr. Nwankwo, your 1 minute starts now.
I don't know if I get the question. Please.
So I'll take it again. You know, if you were to identify 1 or 2 priorities for African government to focus on post-pandemic recovery, what will it be?
The way I look at it, I think weak institutions really, undermine everything when it comes to nation building. So it's just unfortunate that the sort of time it will take to sort of reverse your institutions, which in the first place weren't modeled for local culture and mannerisms. So no matter how much of a debate we have on the international law, what do we do with regional frameworks, institutions, it's still critical that we're talking about sovereign debt, for instance. When these funds or when debt forgiveness happens, which has happened in the past, or let's say the system becomes more transparent or welcoming or to African countries, what now happens to the domestic institutions? So I think our leaders should channel much of the energy to building credible individuals and stronger institutions so that they can, effectively disburse these funds and also generate our own revenue to be used internally. So I think at the end of the day, what is most important are building strong institutions.
Thank you very much. So strong institutions, transparency, accountability gap, fix them so that you can be ready to take advantage of the opportunities. Thank you so much, Dr. Nwankwo. So to Donald now. So we're now in that minute where I'm like, please stick to time. 1 minute, over to you. And then we can have the last word on this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I would say as African people, in direct answer to the question, I would say as African people, what we need to do now is to go into campaign mode. I think we've been very much in polite advocacy mode, where the academics do their writings and they take them around, and others do, other aspects of work. We work around UN processes and so on. And if we could just consider this as though it was almost a war, and we have to fight back and deploy troops. I think we really, really need to go into campaign mode. I think as citizens, we can then come together and say, we've developed, this is our statement of principles, we develop it and sign it up as citizens. I think we can then just go to the AU and really just approach and confront the AU from all sides. It would be easy for us to think that it's important to go to the Economic Affairs Division of the AU because there are issues to do with the economy here. But I think there are also just issues to do with politics. So a very frontal engagement with the Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security. And I think we need to look at the small wins that will build up towards our heads of state actually adopting a common African position on this issue. And, inspiring things are all over. So for instance, in SADC, the Southern African Development Community, their parliamentary forum has been working on a model law on public finance management, and they're going to adopt it very soon. And it's going to provide, impetus for the 14 member states of SADC, for the parliaments, if they want to actually amend the public finance management laws. So I would say, just go very strongly into campaign mode. It's a fight for our lives.
Thank you so much, Donald. And you know, it's I cannot express how much of a joy it is to hear this diversity of perspectives that take account of the unique context of African states, but also from various experts who bring various issues to the table. If there's one way to put this, I think the value of having these conversations across several sectors, across several experts at the same time, right? And collaborating, as this event has so thankfully to Hazel brought us together again the second year, is important. So we hope on the one hand that we'll carry this on. Last year when Professor Gathi ended the session, he expressed hope that the second one would happen. It has happened. We will share this, and we want to thank the Hazel for putting this together. We thank President incoming Gregory Shaffer. We thank Wes and everyone at the Tiller House for their effort in putting this together. We also want to say personalizing international law is this year's theme next week in DC. We hope you can join us in person. If you cannot, we hope you register and participate virtually as well. But from me and from the excellent panelists we have today, thank you so much for being part of this